September 13th, 1944, dawn at Dachau. 4 women stood in the courtyard. They had been brought from their cells before the sun rose, before the other prisoners woke, before witnesses could gather. The SS preferred executions at this hour, when the air was still cold enough to see your breath, when the camp was silent except for the distant hum of the crematorium. 3 of the women were SOE agents, Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army. They had survived months of interrogation, solitary confinement, and transport through the collapsing Reich. Their names were Yolande Beekman, Eliane Plumen, Madeleine Demerment. The 4th woman was different. She had been kept in chains. Not the standard restraints, chains. Her wrists and ankles bore the marks of months in irons, the kind reserved for prisoners considered exceptionally dangerous or exceptionally valuable. Her file, stamped Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, indicated she was to disappear without trace, without trial, without record. The Gestapo had beaten her repeatedly. She had attempted escape twice. Even in Pforzheim prison, even in solitary confinement, even after the war was clearly lost, she had refused to cooperate. Her name, according to the executioner's log, was Nora Baker, but that wasn't her real name. She had been born Nur-Nisa Inayat Khan, light of womanhood, descendant of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, princess of a fallen Indian kingdom, daughter of a Sufi mystic, author of children's stories, trained harpist, and for 118 days in occupied Paris, the most important and most vulnerable radio operator the Allies had in France. When the single bullet entered the back of her skull, her last word, according to a prisoner who claimed to hear it, was liberté, freedom. But that ending, like so much of Nur Inayat Khan's story, was written long before the war began. Moscow, 1914. The world Nur was born into was already dying. Her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was a Sufi master and musician who had left India to bring the message of mystical Islam to the West. Her mother, Ora Ray Baker, was an American from New Mexico who had converted and followed him into a life of itinerant spirituality. They met in California. They married in London. And by the time Nur arrived, New Year's Day, 1914, the family was in Moscow, living in borrowed rooms, sustained by philosophy and little else. 6 months later, the Great War began. The Khans fled to England, then to France, settling finally in a Sufi commune outside Paris. Nur grew up in a house filled with music, poetry, meditation, and the belief that all religions were paths to the same divine truth. Her father taught ahimsa, nonviolence. He taught that the soul's purpose was compassion. He taught that hatred was a poison and war a failure of the human spirit. Nur absorbed it all. She learned the harp. She wrote fairy tales, delicate moral stories published in French children's magazines and later broadcast on Radio Paris. She studied child psychology at the Sorbonne. She was shy, dreamy, soft-voiced. Her brothers called her Babouli, little sister. Friends described her as gentle, sometimes to the point of impracticality. When her father died suddenly in 1927, Nur, just 13, became the emotional anchor of the family. She cared for her mother, who never fully recovered. She meditated daily. She believed sincerely that the world could be healed through love. Then, in May 1940, the Wehrmacht crossed the Belgian border. The fall of France was not a battle. It was a catastrophe in 6 weeks. Nur and her family fled Paris with millions of others, part of the great civilian exodus that clogged the roads south. Luftwaffe Stukas strafed the columns. Refugees abandoned cars, carts, belongings. Nur's mother, frail and disoriented, had to be carried part of the way. They made it to Bordeaux, then to England, aboard one of the last ships out. Nur had left behind her harp, her manuscripts, her childhood. She arrived in London with nothing but the conviction that everything she had believed about peace, about nonviolence, about the goodness of humanity, had just been devoured by history. She was 26 years old, and she wanted to fight. It should have been impossible. The British military in 1940 didn't recruit women for combat. It certainly didn't recruit foreign nationals, and it had no use for pacifist princesses who wrote fairy tales. But Noor was stubborn. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAF, as a radio operator. She was assigned to a bomber training station, where she transmitted weather reports and landing instructions. Mundane work, safe work. She hated it. What gnawed at her wasn't boredom. It was guilt. Her friends, her neighbors, everyone she had known in France, they were still there, under the boot. And she was in England, comfortable, untouched. In her diary, she wrote, "I wish some Indians would win high military distinction in this war. If one or two could do something in the Allied service which was very brave and which everybody admired, it would help to make a bridge between the English people and the Indians." She didn't write, "I want to be that bridge," but she did. And in the autumn of 1942, someone noticed. The recruiters for the Special Operations Executive didn't advertise. They watched. They listened. They identified candidates through a combination of intelligence reports, personal recommendations, and psychological profiles. They looked for people with language skills, cultural fluency, and, above all, the ability to lie convincingly under pressure. Noor Inayat Khan's file came to their attention for two reasons. First, she was fluent in French. Native fluent. Parisian fluent. Second, she had applied repeatedly for more dangerous assignments. An officer was sent to interview her. What he found was complicated. Noor was intelligent, motivated, and fearless. She was also, by every conventional measure, entirely unsuited for undercover work. She was too honest, too trusting, too emotionally transparent. One evaluator wrote that she was not overburdened with brains and temperamentally unsuitable. Another called her a splendid, vague, dreamy creature, far too conspicuous. The psychological assessment concluded she would be a liability in the field, but there was a problem. By late 1942, the SOE's networks in France were collapsing. Wireless operators, pianists in SOE slang, were being caught faster than they could be replaced. The average life expectancy of a radio operator in occupied Paris was 6 weeks. 6 weeks, because every time a pianist transmitted, the Funkabwehr, the German radio detection units, triangulated the signal. Every broadcast was a gamble. And the Gestapo was very, very good at its job. The SOE was desperate. So despite the warnings, despite the psychological red flags, Noor Inayat Khan was accepted into training. Her code name would be Madeleine. Her cover identity, Jean-Marie Renier, children's nurse. Her mission, return to Paris and become the voice of the resistance. She almost didn't make it through training. The SOE's finishing school was a cluster of requisitioned estates in the Scottish Highlands, where recruits learned sabotage, silent killing, interrogation resistance, and the craft of deception. Noor excelled at Morse code. Her musical training made her one of the fastest typists in her class. But she struggled with everything else. She couldn't lie smoothly. She hesitated during combat drills. During a mock Gestapo interrogation, she broke down in tears. Her instructors recommended she be dropped from the program, but her commanding officer, Maurice Buckmaster, head of SOE's French section, overruled them. Why? Because Noor had one quality that mattered more than all the others combined. She would go. Most agents, when confronted with the reality of the mission, the isolation, the risk, the near certainty of capture, found reasons to withdraw. They didn't lack courage. They simply possessed the survival instinct that keeps most people alive. Noor Inayat Khan didn't have that instinct, or perhaps she had something stronger, the belief that her life mattered less than the cause. On the night of June 16, 1943, Noor boarded a Lysander aircraft at RAF Tangmere. The small single-engine plane was painted matte black. It carried no markings. The pilot would fly low, beneath radar, and land in a dark field outside Le Mans, where resistance fighters would be waiting with flashlights to mark the runway. Noor carried a false identity card, a suitcase, and a Mark II radio transceiver weighing 30 pounds. The flight took 2 hours. When she stepped out onto French soil, it was the first time she had been home in 3 years, and she had exactly 118 days left to live. Paris, June 1943. The city looked the same. The Seine still glittered. The cafes still served coffee, or what passed for it. The chestnut trees along the boulevards still bloomed in summer, but everything beneath the surface had rotted. The swastika flew over the Hôtel de Crillon. German officers strolled the Champs-Élysées in polished boots. The Gestapo headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch, a beautiful Haussmann building with tall windows and wrought-iron balconies, had become the most feared address in France. In its basement cells, resistors were tortured with methodical precision. On its upper floors, the Sicherheitsdienst maintained files on every known agent, every suspected network, every whispered name. The occupation had lasted 3 years, and it had learned to smile. Noor arrived in Paris on June 17, 1943, and immediately joined the Prosper Network, the largest SOE circuit in northern France. Her assignment was straightforward: receive messages from London via Morse code, encode them, and pass them to resistance leaders. Then collect intelligence, encode it, and transmit it back. Simple, vital, deadly, because every time she powered up her radio, every time she tapped out a message on her Morse key, she became visible. The science of radio detection was, by 1943, nearly perfect. The Germans operated mobile direction-finding vans disguised as delivery trucks, each equipped with loop antennas that could detect a transmission within seconds and triangulate its source within minutes. A skilled operator could pinpoint a radio to within a city block. If the broadcast lasted longer than 20 minutes, they could identify the building. Longer than 30, the room. Standard SOE protocol required pianists to move constantly, never transmit from the same location twice, and keep every broadcast under 15 minutes. But even 15 minutes could be too long. The Gestapo had another advantage: turned agents, captured radio operators who, under torture or threat, agreed to continue transmitting under German control. London had safeguards, security checks, bluff checks, deliberate errors that signaled duress, but the system wasn't foolproof. By the time Noor arrived, the Prosper Network had been operating for 18 months. It had over 1,000 members. It had coordinated parachute drops, sabotage missions, and intelligence gathering across occupied France. It was also completely compromised. What Noor didn't know, what no one in Paris knew, was that the Gestapo had been watching Prosper for weeks. The network's leader, Francis Suttle, codenamed Prosper, believed his circuit was secure. He moved openly, met contacts in cafes, expanded operations aggressively. He believed that secrecy mattered less than speed, that the Allies would invade soon, and that the resistance needed to be ready. He was half right. The invasion was coming. But not in 1943. On June 23rd, 6 days after Noor arrived, the Gestapo struck. In a single coordinated sweep, they arrested Prosper, his second-in-command, and dozens of operatives across Paris. Safe houses were raided. Weapons caches were seized. The entire network, built over months of careful work, collapsed in an afternoon. Noor was not at the meeting that was raided. She was in the attic of a house in the 16th arrondissement, transmitting a weather report to London. When she finished, she packed her radio, climbed down, and stepped into a city where every other SOE agent had just been captured. She didn't know it yet, but within 24 hours, she would be the only active radio operator the British had left in Paris. London sent the recall order immediately. The message came through on June 25th: return to England. Network compromised. Await extraction. Noor acknowledged receipt, and then she refused. Her reasoning was simple. If she left, London would be blind. The resistance would have no way to coordinate with the Allies. The agents who had survived would have no lifeline. Maurice Buckmaster, back in London, argued with her via coded messages. He told her the mission was over. He told her she was too exposed, too inexperienced, too recognizable. Noor replied, "I am staying." It was the single most important decision of her life. For the next 3 months, Noor Inayat Khan became the sole link between occupied Paris and the free world. She transmitted constantly, far beyond safe limits. She moved her radio every few days, lugging the 30-pound transceiver across the city in a suitcase, smiling at checkpoints, her heart hammering. She sent over 200 messages. She coordinated supply drops. She relayed intelligence on German troop movements. She kept the remnants of the resistance alive. But every broadcast made her more visible, and the Gestapo was listening. Her tradecraft was, by professional standards, catastrophic. She kept written copies of her messages, a violation of every SOE rule. She returned to the same safe houses. She trusted people she barely knew. Once, she left her codebook in a taxi and only recovered it by sheer luck. Friends urged her to be more careful. She smiled and said she would. She didn't. It wasn't carelessness. It was something else. A kind of fatalism, perhaps, or faith. Noor believed that her purpose was to serve, and if that service required risk, then risk was irrelevant. In her private writings, she quoted her father. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. She was planting. But the Gestapo was closing in. By September, they knew her cover name. They knew her roots. They knew the buildings where she transmitted. What they didn't know was her real identity, or how to catch her. Because despite her amateur mistakes, Noor had one skill that saved her again and again. She could read a street. She had grown up in Paris. She knew the rhythm of the arrondissements, the flow of foot traffic, the places where a woman alone would draw attention and the places where she'd disappear. She knew how to move through crowds, how to change her appearance with a scarf or a different gait, how to sense surveillance. The Gestapo sent watchers. She evaded them. They set traps at known dead drops. She never appeared. They intercepted her messages, tried to mimic her fist, the unique rhythm of her Morse transmissions, and feed false intelligence back to London. But Noor's fist was too distinctive, her airs too personal. London detected the deception. For 3 months, the most wanted woman in Paris stayed free. But in October, someone talked. Betrayal is almost never dramatic. It doesn't come with a grand confrontation or a moment of revelation. It's quiet. It's a name whispered in a cell. It's a promise made under duress. It's the exhausted calculation that survival matters more than loyalty. Noor's betrayer was a woman named Renee Gary, the sister of a resistance colleague. Renee was not a collaborator, not cruel. She was simply terrified. The Gestapo had arrested her, questioned her, and offered a deal. Information in exchange for her sister's life. She gave them Noor's address. On the afternoon of October 13, 1943, Noor returned to her apartment at 40 Rue Erlanger in the 16th arrondissement. She climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, and walked into a room where 3 Gestapo officers were waiting. They had already found the radio. They had already found her notebooks. She ran. She made it to the roof. According to Gestapo reports, Noor fought like a tiger. She kicked, scratched, bit. She tried to climb out a window. When they grabbed her, she refused to stop struggling. It took 3 men to restrain her. Even in handcuffs, she tried to escape. They dragged her down to a car and drove her to 84 Avenue Foch at Gestapo headquarters. She was taken to an office on the 4th floor. The interrogator was a man named Hans Kiefer, head of the Gestapo's counterintelligence division in Paris. He was polite, precise, and utterly without mercy. He knew who she was. He knew her code name. He knew the names of everyone she had worked with. What he wanted was her cooperation. Noor, still in handcuffs, looked at him and said nothing. The interrogation lasted weeks. Kiefer tried every method. He showed her the evidence, the messages, the names, the proof that the network was destroyed. He promised her safety, a comfortable imprisonment, a chance to survive the war. Noor refused to answer a single question. He threatened her. She remained silent. He brought in other prisoners, tried to turn her with guilt or camaraderie. She said nothing. Finally, in frustration, Kiefer made a mistake. He left her alone in the office overnight, assuming she was too broken, too exhausted to try anything. She picked the lock on her handcuffs with a pin. Then she climbed out a 4th-story window and onto the roof. She almost made it. She crossed 2 rooftops in the dark, heading toward an adjacent building. If she had reached it, she might have disappeared into the Paris night, might have evaded recapture, might have survived. But a guard saw her silhouette against the sky. The alarm went up. They dragged her back inside, bleeding, furious, unbroken. Kiefer ordered her placed in chains, wrists and ankles, and declared her highly dangerous. She was transferred to a civilian prison in Pforzheim, Germany, where she was kept in solitary confinement for 10 months. She attempted escape again. She was chained to the wall. She refused to give her name. She refused to cooperate. Month after month, alone in the dark, Noor Inayat Khan, pacifist, princess, storyteller, remained defiant.